% of the vote and 3 MEPs. Labour came fifth, securing a share of less than 10%, meaning it no longer holds any Scottish seats in the European Parliament. From Glasgow, here's our Scotland editor, Sarah Smith.
The SNP ran a campaign that was unambiguously pro-EU. Under the slogan, "Scotland is for Europe, let's say it loud and clear." That was a gamble, as around 1/3 of their supporters voted leave, but it paid off. They won their highest vote yet in an EU election, taking half of the 6 MEP seats in Scotland. The SNP leader Nicola Sturgeon says she's delighted.
My priority is in the short term to protect Scotland from Brexit and to stand up for Scotland's interests, and in the medium to longer term to hopefully persuade the people of Scotland that the best future is to put ourselves in charge of our own destiny so that we can make these decisions for ourselves as an independent country.
Second place in Scotland was taken by the Brexit Party, who get 1 MEP, and that shows Scotland is not unanimously pro-EU. The Tory vote dropped by almost 6%, but they managed to retain the 1 seat they already held, while the Lib Dems increased their vote and gained 1 MEP. The really big losers in Scotland were Labour, kicked into 5th place, losing both of their MEPs. The SNP specifically asked Remain voters, who are not normally SNP supporters, to lend them their votes to send an anti-Brexit message. That strategy does seem to have paid off, but it does also mean they cannot try and suggest this result shows a surge in support for independence. And yet, the First Minister has confirmed today she will introduce legislation for a second independence referendum to the Scottish Parliament this week.
The Brexit Party swept to victory in Wales, gaining 2 MEPs. There was a strong showing for Plaid Cymru, which won 1 seat, while Labour, which also took a seat, recorded its worst ever performance. BBC Wales political editor Felicity Evans reports.
Never has Labour come third in Wales. Never has it been beaten by the nationalist party Plaid Cymru. Until now. Adam Price is Plaid's new leader.
Many of those particularly disaffected Labour voters were voting for us absolutely because of they felt on this issue of Brexit they'd been completely let down by the Labour leadership, both in Jeremy Corbyn and here in Wales. But it allows us to begin a conversation with those voters, doesn't it? Because once you've broken the habit of a lifetime of voting Labour, as many of those voters will have done, then you're open to maybe doing it again.
Welsh Labour sources point the finger at the UK party leadership and their ambivalence over Brexit. But the party's Welsh leader, Mark Drakeford, has been resisting pressure from within his party to come out more strongly for another referendum. Today he made that call, to the relief of some in the party, but too late for others. But the laurels belong to the Brexit Party. They came top in 19 of Wales' 22 local authority areas. One of their MEPs, Nathan Gill, plans to be awkward.
It's going to be a pain in the backside for the EU, I should imagine. We're not going there to make it work, are we? I mean, we told them, let Britain leave the EU with a decent trade deal and you won't have any problems with Nigel Farage ever coming back. They didn't do that.
The political mould has been cracked here in Wales. What we don't know, yet, is whether it's been shuttered.
The Cross-Community Alliance Party in Northern Ireland has had the best election result in its history, securing one of the 3 available seats. The 2 others have gone to the Democratic Unionists and Sinn Féin, with the result being seen as a significant shift towards the centre ground. Our Ireland correspondent Chris Page reports from the Count Centre in County Londonderry.
Ever since the first European elections in 1979, Northern Ireland has had 2 Unionist MEPs and 1 Nationalist. But the Alliance Party leader Naomi Long has changed that. She's more than doubled her party's vote to ensure she'll be heading to Brussels. Mrs Long has campaigned strongly for another referendum and said her success represented people's desire to stay in the EU. The counting process hasn't officially finished yet, but the overall result is certain. The other 2 seats have been won by the Sinn Féin candidate Martina Anderson, who's also anti-Brexit, and the Democratic Unionist Party's Diane Dodds, who's a Brexiteer. 57% of people in Northern Ireland cast their first preferences for parties which oppose Brexit. A similar proportion voted to remain in the 2016 referendum. The Ulster Unionist Party didn't retain the seat it held for 40 years. The electoral blow for unionism is likely to fuel further the debate about the constitutional future of this part of the UK.
Campaigners on either side of the Brexit debate have claimed victory in these elections. But as Chris Morris from our Reality Check team explains, parties in favour of a no-deal Brexit secured virtually the same level of support as those advocating another referendum.
One thing has emerged clearly from these elections. For many people, their preference for leave or remain is currently more important than any traditional party loyalty. Both sides of that Brexit divide can take some comfort from the election results, but all they really show is that the country is as divided as ever. The combined vote across Great Britain of the two parties that campaigned to leave the EU without a deal, the Brexit Party and UKIP, was just under 35%. Similarly, the combined vote of three parties who clearly want to remain, the Liberal Democrats, the Greens and Change UK, was just over 35%. You could add nationalist parties in Wales and Scotland to the Remain column, but it's worth remembering that the SNP is also backed in Scotland by many Leave voters. As for the two main Westminster parties, the Conservatives campaigned for Brexit but not for no deal, while Labour tried to appeal to both Leave and Remain voters. Both suffered very disappointing nights. So it's a mixed message, and it's wise to treat with caution any attempt to say what these results might mean for any possible referendum in the future. Another factor to take into consideration is turnout, which was just under 37%. That's higher than the European elections 5 years ago, but far lower than the 68% of the electorate who voted in the last general election, or the 72% who voted in the Brexit referendum. In other words, despite the political heat generated by the Brexit debate, many voters stayed at home. Another election or another referendum would bring many of them out again, but it's impossible to say how they might choose to vote.
Across the rest of the EU, the two main centre-right and centre-left groups lost their combined majority in the European Parliament for the first time, as nationalists gained ground at their expense. But as our Europe correspondent Kevin Connolly explains, there was also a surge in support for the Greens and the Liberals.
In the end of these elections, the much-discussed surge for populist parties of the right and far right never quite happened. Where they were already strong, Poland, Hungary and France, for example, such parties did well, and in Italy Matteo Salvini's League party topped the poll, a result which he said would remind Brussels that the EU is made up of separate countries with separate interests and identities.
Today's vote means that the rules in Europe will change, not only for the decisions of the Italians, but also for the decisions of the French, the English, for the Hungarians, the Poles, the Finns, the Swedes, the Danish, and so a new Europe is born.
But the populists didn't have it all their own way. There were no breakthroughs for them in either the Netherlands or Germany, and while Marine Le Pen's rally for France topped the poll, it didn't improve on its showing last time around. The Liberal Party of Emmanuel Macron was pipped at the post, but its leading candidate, Nathalie Loiseau, was still able to argue that a rising tide of anti-EU populism had been stemmed.
It's not very good news for the French, because the National Rally was ahead in 2014, under a different name, but with the same ideas, and it's ahead again this time around. We'll have the same number of seats in the European Parliament, so I'd say that we did the job.
There were interesting individual developments everywhere. The Greens became Germany's second largest party, and Socialists did well in Spain and the Netherlands. One striking development was a fall in support for big establishment parties of right and left, which have between them always comfortably controlled the European Parliament. For the first time, their combined total of seats doesn't add up to a majority. Among the major parties dealing with disappointment was Germany's CDU, the traditionally powerful Christian Democrats. Their new leader, Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, acknowledged the dangers from right and left.
The question for us is, if we're in the centre ground in such controversial times, will we be crushed in the controversy, as has happened to our sister parties in France and Italy? Or can we be a people's party in the middle that brings both sides together?
EU leaders are about to start carving up some of the big institutional jobs in Brussels, including a replacement for Jean-Claude Juncker at the European Commission. The more fractured European parliamentary landscape may complicate that process, and it might even mean that the centre-right bloc in Brussels could lose control of the appointment to a candidate with Green and Liberal support.
The Austrian Chancellor Sebastian Kurz and his centre-right government have been forced from office following a vote of no confidence. The move came after his coalition with the far-right Freedom Party broke up last week, when its leader was implicated in a corruption scandal. Mr Kurz, who came to power in 2017, is Austria's shortest-serving Chancellor. Our correspondent in Vienna, Bethany Bell, has more details.
Sebastian Kurz has been credited with turning around the fortunes of his Conservative People's Party. It celebrated a big win in the European elections. But Mr Kurz's fall has been swift in the wake of a scandal which engulfed his former coalition partner, the far-right Freedom Party. He and his government lost a vote of no confidence, supported by the opposition Social Democrats and the Freedom Party. They said Mr Kurz should bear some of the blame for the collapse of the coalition. Austria's president must now nominate a new chancellor to head a caretaker government that can hold until the next national election, which is expected to take place in September.
French police have arrested 4 people after a suspected parcel bomb exploded in Lyon last week, injuring 13 people. The device, which was packed with screws and ball bearings, was detonated outside a bakery. Detectives say one of those detained is a 24-year-old Algerian man suspected of planting the bomb. Reports from Myanmar say 7 soldiers who had been sentenced to 10 years in prison for killing 10 Rohingya Muslim men and boys have been quietly released. They had served less than a year in jail. Here's David Bamford.
When photos emerged 2 years ago of 10 Rohingyas forced to kneel before being executed, it created a worldwide furore that even the Myanmar government couldn't ignore. 7 soldiers were duly sentenced to 10 years in prison for murder. But apparently they didn't stay there long. Reuters news agency has learned they've been free since November, having served less than a year. That's even fewer months in prison than the 2 Pulitzer Prize-winning journalists who originally exposed the murders. Last year they were in prison for violating state security until they were pardoned following intense international pressure.
The French car maker Renault says its board is studying with interest the terms of a merger plan put forward by the Italian-American Fiat Chrysler Group. An alliance would create the world's third